Ask yourself a simple question. What do I know about customers that other people don't know that I can leverage to gain competitive advantage and to drive profitable growth? That would be the message.
Fantastic. Hi, I'm Matt Egol, host of the CX and Culture Connection, the podcast for leaders looking to drive value by focusing on customer experience and culture together. I'm excited to have Bernard Jaworski back on the podcast to discuss his book, The Soul of Strategy. Bernie is the Drucker Chair in Management at Claremont Graduate University, where Peter Drucker actually taught for more than 3 decades. So that chair has a double meaning here. Prior to Claremont, Bernie was a senior partner at Monitor, where he co-led the e-commerce practice. Thanks for coming back on the podcast, Bernie.
Great to be back, Matt. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
I always enjoy our conversations, and I apologize for having a scratchy voice. I was just sharing with Bernie that I did some very poor karaoke a few days ago, and I'm still recovering. So I'll try to take some sips of water during our conversation. So Bernie, just to get us going, I can see your book in the corner there. It's I really enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed all your books, and excited to talk about it today. As to get us going, why did strategy drift away from Drucker's early emphasis on the customer? After all, he's famous for saying the purpose of a business is to create a customer. So he's the father of modern strategy and management. What happened?
It's interesting. He actually stated that idea back in 1954, so literally 70 years ago. And I think what happened is there were 2 big inflection points, I think, in the history of strategy thinking on the academic side. The first was Michael Porter's classic work in 1980 around the notion of competitive strategy. And all of a sudden you saw that competition was dialed way up. How do we position ourselves in a particular industry versus competition? So competition was like the center of gravity for where it was going. That stayed in place for a couple decades. And then all of a sudden we shifted over to, guess what? We should be thinking about our resources, our unique capabilities. The resource-based view of the firm is the way that academics refer to it. But the basic idea is, hey, you've got unique, rare resources. Those should be a source of competitive advantage, right? What's weird about this whole thing is simply that folks from the strategy discipline within academia tend to ignore customers. And so the first phase of being competitor-oriented, that was from the strategy area and economics area. And the second area is from the management discipline. But nobody from the marketing discipline, who kind of owns the voice of the customer, actually try to take a point of view about what is strategy, not marketing strategy, but overall corporate strategy. And the idea that needs to be centered around customers. So what Dave, my co-author, and I did is said, wait a second, this is kind of a problematic issue. The first order issue is customers. Then you think about competition, and then you think about capabilities. So we reverse the order of how to think about the priorities of the classic kind of 3 C's to say, it's not about company capabilities or about competition. It's about competitors. Really, that's the centerpiece for how you think about strategy.
You know, it's interesting that for a lot of customer experience folks, they often get involved after the strategy's set. And that's to they're helping make sure the CX is congruent with the brand, or the CX is congruent with the MVP, with the mission, vision, purpose. But actually, a lot of the opportunity is to embed customer-centric thinking in the strategy itself. And in fact, in one of our recent episodes with Colleen Fazio, who's the CX analyst at Forrester, focused on customer experience and voice of the customer, Colleen put it really well. She said, we're trying to bring CX closer to product and strategy versus make it something you do afterwards to fix issues. So it sounds like a lot of what you're talking about is that the evolution of strategy lost sight of how central customer experience is to the strategy, and we need to bring it back to make them closer again. Is that a fair point?
That's a very fair point. And I think the idea, it's kind of silly, as we've talked about this, to say, gee whiz, you start with the customer first. Why would you start with competition first? Why would you start with your capabilities? The issue is your ability to have unique differentiated insights about your target segment. So it's not just collecting the confirmatory Me Too data. It's actually trying to get unique insights. And from that, you can then leverage them into decision making. So for us, the starting point is let's really understand the market, where the market is now, where the market's going, what customer segments are emerging to be important, which ones are decreasing in importance, how are they evolving? Those are the questions that start a strategy conversation from our perspective. So it is very, and then you could say, okay, what is the customer experience? What do they want, right? So those are also early stage input conversations, we believe, to thinking about what the corporate strategy should look like.
To make this personal for a second, on my own journey, I started out at Booz and Company, and then was later at PwC when PwC acquired Booz and renamed it Strategy But Booz kind of fell into the resource and dynamic capabilities world within your 4 strategy schools, because like Cesare Minardi and Paul Lyman, you actually reference them in the book. They created capabilities driven strategy as a framework, building on a lot of the other thinking of other great thinkers. But that was all about like strategy takes the lens of who am I? And if you understand who you are and what makes you strong, you'll make better choices. Like you start with the who am I question versus the customer and bring the customer later. And so I was indoctrinated into that and did a lot of fun work that way. But personally, I got very motivated. And Paul and Cesare are brilliant and great people. I'm not taking away from them. I did some work with others to help launch Booz Digital, which was about changing the way we did strategy to focus more on human-centered design and like the culture and change side of it too, so that we could drive more agility, more testing, more experimentation, all to put the customer more in the center of strategy. So instead of writing documents, we would do things, right? And what your book has done for me is put in more context, why that felt so important to me, and others I team with, is about what does it mean to put the customer at the center? Well, for us, it meant that the way we did strategy needed to be more design thinking forward, and we needed to be able to engage and create experiences. I think your book, for me, what really hit home is like the whole field needs to adjust, not just people who build experiences, right? Let's not just get good at creating experiences. Let's change the way we do the strategy process itself.
It's an organization-wide issue, right? And actually, Drucker said this, that it's, it's not the marketing department per se. It's an organization-wide lens that you take to understand where the market is going and how you think it's evolving. In fact, Drucker even said you don't even adapt to it. In some cases, you actually modify and change it. So the big issue when you think about it is that you've got to have evidence. It's evidence-based decision-making based on what's going on in the market. That's, it's not management judgment, it's evidence, right? And what we said in the book is that there's actually 4 choices that you make once you collect the evidence. The first is the one that everybody thinks about, your product portfolio. How do I add products? How do I delete products? How do I modify? How do I add features? How do I add solutions? How do I bundle it? What's the value proposition? It's the classic how to win set of questions. And that's where everybody goes when they think about customer centricity. How do I design a better product or modify products or whatever, right? That's kind of where it all goes. But there's 3 other reasons you want to collect evidence in the marketplace around customers. The second is the segmentation question, and it's not if you have unique evidence about what's going on in the marketplace, you should have a very unique segmentation scheme that no one else sees. No one understands it. No one even understands kind of why you're even doing what you're doing, because you've seen the market differently and you segmented the market differently, right? So, Southwest Airlines, everybody always talks about their capability system. Their big insight was it's not about business class, first class, and economy. It's about short haul travel. That was their big insight that then led to the evolution of the company, right? So segmentation is the second big choice. Third big choice is the reason you get evidence about what's going on with customers is the ability to kind of see the future, the ability to see where they're evolving to. And we call that shaping markets. Industry leaders don't accept the conventional customer behavior as is, they shape it. Netflix, binge watching, we never even heard of the term binge watching, right? We never understood that you could put an entire season of a series on the platform and be able to watch all at once, right? All this is changing customer behavior, right? So leaders shape markets. And the third big decision is this one. And then the fourth one is abandoning things, making room for change, making room for the transformation. The reason you get customer insight is to say, we don't need this product. We don't need this HR system. We don't need this information system. Oh, we do need this set of analytics, and we can get rid of this previous set of elements, right? So abandonment is one big decision that is also there. So there's four big decisions that are made based upon the evidence of the market.
Bernie, I love the way that you've talk about choices and cascading choices and how having evidence allows you to make better choices. A lot of what you're describing is cultural and is the way leaders show up and collaborate with each other. And you emphasize that in the book. And I also want to give a shout out. You gave Southwest as an example. I had Bill Tierney from Southwest on the podcast for episode 50. Be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast if you want to make sure you get episodes like that. But I'm always glad to have great guests like Bernie and like Bill on the podcast. So Southwest is a great story. When you talk about evidence and about decisions, how do you think about that in terms of leadership behaviors? Like, one of the things you definitely write about in the book is curiosity and other leadership behaviors. Do you want to elaborate a little bit for the audience about how leadership behavior goes into getting the right culture to support evidence-based decisions?
So let me mention three. The first is obviously having an outside-in perspective as opposed to inside-out. So the ability to say, I really want to understand what's going on out there and be unconstrained by the shiny objects that you have inside the company. So how do you get away from being product-focused, looking at what the customer truly is looking for? The product is simply a vessel to provide the outcome that the customer is coming. The second issue you just raised, which is curiosity. It's not curiosity in general. It's curiosity with respect to customers and segments and markets. Why are they behaving that way? Why is there an incongruity? Why would customers wait in line for 20 minutes? Or, in this situation, but not wait in line for more than 30 seconds in another situation, right? So if I go to my favorite sandwich shop, I may wait 20 minutes, Franklin's Barbecue in Austin, Texas. I'll wait 6 hours, right? But if I go to my bank, I want to be served within 30 seconds. If I'm not served within 30 seconds, I'm really upset, right? So why is that? So it's a curiosity. And the third is something that Drucker mentioned a long time ago, which is, and now everybody uses the term ambidexterity, but Drucker mentioned this a long time ago, which is managing in 2 time periods, managing continuity and change. And so the ability to think not just about where the customer is now, but where is the customer going to be in 5 years? A wonderful case study by IMD recently is the Nespresso case study, where for about a 20-year period, Nespresso was the guy, the player, man. Everybody had Nespressos, right? And then when you teach the case study and you have folks in the room that are in their 40s and 50s, you say, does anybody's son or daughter have an espresso machine at home? And the answer is no. So they were ridiculously customer focused, but then they missed the evolution of where the youth market was going, right? So this is attention of the ability to think in 2 time periods. I have to deliver against my current segment, current needs, and really that's going to be my cash cow. But I have to constantly test and evolve and think carefully about what's the customer 5 years from now or 10 years from now going to be looking at? What do they want? What do they care about? What's their expressed need? What's their latent need, right? And Nespresso didn't do that with the youth market. They became irrelevant and they're playing catch up now.
I mean, what you're highlighting is how strategy is so inextricably linked to customer insights and to design thinking, that if you don't understand the personas that you're targeting and their motivations and needs and wants and build really good insights, your segmentation's not going to be good, and you're not going to get rapid insights to adjust and evolve. And that it's not just the product, but all the experiences that go around it that create that emotional connection.
Yeah, in fact, you think about it, going back to the capability stuff. If you were doing capability assessment within Nespresso, and you're doing that work, what you're probably doing is saying, they have unique capabilities to develop pods. They have interesting migration to sustainability around the pods. Customers want more foam, so I'm going to have a new machine that's going to have some foam, right? That's what they're. But really, the fundamental capability is, guess what? The youth market has moved to cafes. They don't drink alone at home. They move to big drinks that are served. They want to have it in a cafe. So how does the capability that you developed around your unique, rare, difficult to copy capabilities around machines and how to run machines and pods and transfer, that's irrelevant to where the market's going, right? So, again, if you're capability focused, I see an issue there, as opposed to being, focused on the fundamental need.
One of the things that I wrote about in my book review for The Soul of Strategy, which I really enjoy writing that and featuring that last month. You talk about the importance of your mission, vision, and purpose being flexible, and so that you can write it in a way and revisit it, particularly the mission, right? So about where are things going, like you're talking about, so it doesn't box you into a very narrow view of where we are today. And another friend of mine, Ken Favreau, I made a comparison. I had him on the podcast to talk about his book, Real Strategy. And Ken likes to say every strategy is built on a big idea, and you have to constantly test whether your big idea is still relevant. And I think the connection point between your book and Ken's thinking, is they're similar in the framework around putting the customer as the first question. And Ken has 3 questions. You have 4 cascading choices, but you're both basically saying constantly test if your big idea is still relevant and whether your mission, vision, purpose needs to adjust, and your strategy can't be static, and you have to constantly look at it.
Yeah, I mean, it almost goes back at some level back to Christensen's stuff around innovator dilemma type stuff, right? In the sense of or Collins' work around why the mighty have fallen, right? It's kind of like, why does these legacy firms not get to the future? And there's lots of good reasons, because you're so focused on your object, your product, your offering, and the fact that it's providing enormous cash, and you're so focused on it that you can't get out of your way. One of the great stories of Netflix, I think, is back in the late 90s when Netflix was just doing DVDs, and they were selling them and they were renting them. And they did a major offsite, I think it was in Texas, where 96% of the revenue was from DVD sales and 4% was from rental. But they sat down and had a kind of an interesting, come to heaven moment where they said, wait a second, we can't beat Amazon or others on sales. So the next day they closed the business. It was generating 96% of the revenue. But it's kind of one of those burn the ships kind of phenomenon once we land on the port, because the answer is if we're going to, that's going to anchor us back and pull us back if we don't close it down. And most companies that are in these legacy models understand where the future is, understand where it's going, and try and do that while they have the anchor of the legacy business. And and that becomes the issue for them. And so this struggle of listening to customers and understanding, and how do we structure, and how do we organize, and how do we get to the future, is a classic issue. And we're seeing in the AI era, we're certainly see this unfolding for many different companies.
Well, you say classic, and you use the metaphor of burning the ships, which is straight out of the Iliad. And so I know you're not a classics major by background, but well done.
There you go. I didn't even know I made that. I was using some sort of metaphor there, and I kind of stumbled into the classics there. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, it's a good selling book, so you're in good company there. The Iliad. What we're talking about right now is the concept of abandonment. And that's actually one of the things that I thought was really, really powerful in your book, was not just the importance of innovation and customer-centric thinking and generating insights and evidence to innovate better, but obviously also beyond the product experiences, not just product. You also talk about touching all 4 Ps, but you also talk a lot about abandonment and come back and do it frequently in the book. Do you want to elaborate a little bit about why abandonment's so important, and what do leaders need to do to build that muscle to be able, because that's cultural in an organization, to have a culture that allows you to do that. It's not just avoiding fear of failure when you launch new things, but avoiding the fear of walking away.
It's a very big issue. Every time I'm in front of executives and I have a chance to talk about the book, and I go through the 4 big choices, when I get to abandonment, there's this look on their face like, that's the issue for me. That's the issue. And what I'm saying is, don't abandon for the sake of abandon because you have evidence. Customers are declining the use. Customers are emerging here. You've got evidence, right? And that's why you need to abandon. Importantly, by abandon, I mean everything. So it's not just about products and solutions. It's about how you manufacture, what your operations are, what your services, what your HR systems are, what your IT systems are, what data you collect, right? Everything the organization does needs to be thrown up into the air and say, what do we need to abandon? Drucker asked the best question about this. He said, if you're going to start the business all over again today, knowing what we now know, what would you do? And it's never been the case for me, Matt, when I'm in a room with executives where I say that and people say, I keep everything. Most people say, I get rid of A and B and C and D and E and F and G. And it's like a laundry list. And I say, why don't you do that? And they said, Bernie, you don't understand. It's very hard to do in my company. And we have a culture that gets in the way of that. We have people whose job responsibility is to run that unit. We have our organization doesn't like change. That's created a lot of revenue or whatever. It's been very successful in the past, and so therefore this legacy keeping us going. And so there's all these different excuses, right? But it's my view is like I go back to them. I say abandonment is as important as innovation, and in fact, you can't innovate effectively unless you abandon. Because most companies you walk into, people are feeling like they're operating 100%. And so if I go in and say, listen, first thing we're going to do before we do anything is we're going to get rid of 20 or 30% of what you're working on. Let's go through that exercise first to free up time for you now to actually focus on customers and understand what customers are looking for, because people don't have time, and so you got to start off with some conversation around abandonment.
This is a really big issue, and I'm going to broaden the aperture, if you allow me, from product innovation and service innovation to change management more broadly. The abandonment's really critical. I have a concept that I did not invent, but I love it. A client CEO that I worked with introduced this language to me, and I love it, called leadership capacity. And the leadership capacity is more than the resources you have available. I mean, there's motivation, commitment in your organization. There's the skills of your organization, and there's the time available of your leaders, their bandwidth, and all your organization, the middle, the front line. AI is dramatically impacting the amount of time people have available, and how we spend that. But like just thinking broadly about change here, the leadership capacity is enormously influenced by abandonment. If you do not abandon systematically, you constrain your capacity to act as an organization, because you're constraining the amount of time available, and also you're constraining people's mindsets and their willingness to change, their commitment to change, because you're telling them we're never going to do anything differently.
I run an exercise. So I run a series of exercises around organizational abandonment. So what do we do enterprise-wide? What do we need to kind of give up? And also, when I do that exercise, I push people and say, don't say less meetings or less email. That's obvious. Let's really look at the guts of what we're doing and ask ourselves strategically, what do we need to abandon, right? And then the other part, that's the organization part. The other thing is I do the exercise at the individual level. I say, I'd be willing to bet if I said, are you working 100% of your time on all your really important activities? What percentage of your time is actually spent on stuff that's actually not important and potentially wasteful and not a good use of your time? Usually get 20, 30, 40% answers. And I say, okay, so the first step we're going to do is we're going to do this exercise over a 6-month period where we're going to say, what is the idealized time allocation for you? And what is the current time allocation? And obviously we got pie charts with very different allocations. And I say, okay, how do we get there? And the answer is, I've got to abandon some stuff. I got to delegate some stuff. I got to do some other stuff, right? So you can run the exercise of abandonment at both the individual level and at the level of the organization.
This, I think this principle has enormous power, both to pursue experience as a winning strategy, which is like, where do you focus to get the most impact from your investments in experience as a strategy? Are you spending your time on the things that are really deliver the experience? Or are you spending time on the right things? So experience as a winning strategy benefits from the framework that you're talking about. And so does like reinforcing the connection of customer and employee experience, that if the employees aren't spending time on the right things and the employees are not leading in the right way, then you're not going to get an impact on the customer experience and the strategy. So I mentioned both of those because I have mastermind groups, one focused on experience as a winning strategy and one on amplifying your CX and EX together. Let's take a quick run through. I do this every podcast about each of the mastermind groups, and Bernie and I will continue the conversation on the other side. Allow me to briefly interrupt the podcast to share an invitation for you to join one of our mastermind groups. These groups are for leaders building out the CX function at their organization. They are for culture champions looking to develop and sustain behaviors that bring their organization's mission, vision, purpose, and values to life. I'm excited to team with Randy Rothenberg, former CEO of the IAB, on a mastermind group focused on experience as a winning marketing strategy. I'm teaming with Tamar Cohen, who has led CX and EX teams at Zoetis and Travelers, on another group focused on CX EX alignment. Each group meets monthly for 90 minutes. Members receive a coaching hour each month and can attend quarterly workshops. Go to JourneySpark's website for more information. Please DM me on LinkedIn with any questions. Now, let's get back to the podcast. Another thing that you talked about a moment ago, Bernie, is the way people measure things. Like they may resist doing things because this is the way it's done. This is what we report on. So organizations measure more than ever, yet still really struggle to know whether they're creating value. You talk about evidence. What kinds of signals should leaders be paying more attention to that traditional KPIs tend to miss?
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought you were going to go to a different question, which I'm going to address and come back to where you were at. So one of the things we say in our definitions, we say that it actually creates mutual value. When you're customer centered, it doesn't mean you're giving everything away to customers and they're extracting all the value that's created. In fact, it's shared. It has to be a mutual value. So firms need to be profitable. There's this great case study of Kingfisher Airlines in India that had this first class section that the customers loved. It had its own attendants. It had its own chefs. It had its own, butlers. It was just phenomenal service. Lots of great alcohol. And the customers absolutely loved them. But the reality is that it wasn't making the airline any money. So even though they were the best in the world for these customer satisfaction, loyalty, best airline, blah, 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 and the reality is that it just didn't create any economic returns. And so the trick here is to create value for both parties where the customers love it and the firms have great economics kind of as a result of that. So I think the ability to understand who the various stakeholders are in the system, what they're looking for, the term these days a lot of times is ecosystems or stakeholders, right? So, if you're selling in a healthcare system, you've got payers, you've got reimbursement people, you've got the government agencies that are paying for various services, you've got physicians, you've got patients, you've got maybe channels of distribution, and really delivering such that it's a win-win-win for everybody is a really important issue here in terms of what we're trying to do. So yes, customers are centered. Yes, customers you need to deliver against, but boy, you need to take into account the other players for us to have a sustainable run at the offering that we have in the marketplace.
That makes a lot of sense. I think the mutual value point is, it could be extended not just to the customer but to other stakeholders, which you make in the book as well. That stakeholder capitalism is not necessarily undermine the importance of delivering value to shareholders. It just highlights that if you don't deliver value to other stakeholders too, it inhibits your ability to deliver value to the customer and the enterprise.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Drucker, again, 1954, said the very first responsibility of management is economic performance. And the thing, though, that the other part, though, that part B of that is, guess what? In order to drive economic performance, you have to have really deep customer insight and understand where customers are going. And if you do that, you can then deliver high economic performance. So that's the starting point. So it's not just being focused on that, it's being focused on, and also he mentioned more broadly, it's the communities that you serve and everybody you touch, and that's the responsibility of management. So it was early thinking around this notion of what we're now calling stakeholder management versus shareholder.
Now, you promised to come back to the other question I asked. I think mutual value was a great place to start. So thank you for that. I asked you about what type of signals people should pay attention to, and how is that evolving in order to be able to make these to understand mutual value better.
Let me break it down into two different eras. If I'm competing over the next 12 to 18 months, I'm probably just very carefully listening to what customers are saying or not saying. I'm listening to how they're thinking about the products. I'm trying to get insights that allow me to take advantage of this. And the term I use in the book is differentiated insights lead to differentiated solutions, right? So that's a time period one issue. I'm getting insights. Even there, though, it's not just confirmatory insights. Do customers care about price? Do they care about convenience? Yeah, of course they do. It's trying to get at some ways of how they're purchasing differently, what their attitudes are, what their context is. Right? I'm trying to understand deeply what's going on. But that is competing with existing offerings at some level. The interesting part of this equation really is to look about where is the future. Where is the Drucker used to say, where is the future already happened? Like we're trying to understand the early signals of the evolution of where a market is. And I think here, the ability to have those conversations organization-wide, here's what we think is happening over the next 3 to 5 years. Here's the evidence behind it. Here's the ways that we're sort of aggregating our point of view about how we think markets are moving. That point of view about where we think markets are going and understanding that is really the 3 to 5 year game, right? So I've got to allocate resources to understanding both of these. Otherwise, I become the espresso, right? So I've got to be focused on, yes, driving insights and continually evolving, but I also need to allocate, Drucker would say 20% of your time to the future, collecting data around where we think the market's going, and then betting against that. It's not. I always criticize scenario planning because I feel like that's a lean back exercise, whereas a lean in exercise is saying, here's where we think it's going, and we're going to resource behind that. So it's a different framing for where things are going.
You've got me thinking about how do you avoid getting boxed into really incremental thinking versus like more breakthrough thinking, being more open to more, like what would make you more willing to abandon? How do you get insights? And one of the things that I learned, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Bernie, when I was at Booz, was there was a collaboration between some folks at Booz and a professor at Columbia on something called strategic intuition, which was all about like the difference between business intuition and strategic intuition, according to this school of thought, is that business intuition can be valuable, but tends to lead to very incremental changes because it's kind of very inside the box. You're not willing to abandon. You're not willing to challenge. You're always looking for things at the edge of where you are today. And what leads to that breakthrough thinking, what leads to that aha moment is actually often recombining existing things in new ways. But how do you create the conditions to do that without just being Steve Jobs or someone brilliant, right? And what we learned from this is you can do it systematically if you frame up the challenges and then don't jump right to solutions once you frame up the challenges. But the first thing to do is look at how others have solved the same challenge and look for evidence about how others have solved that challenge. And then that becomes inspiration to think of new ideas. And if you do that step of looking for the examples of how others have solved it, there's a great book called The Art of Ideas. I have the book review on the website by Amy Murphy, who was one of the collaborators with the professor on strategic intuition. And she's involved with Columbia now, that folks could check out. We'll have that on screen. But, what I'm finding now with AI is you can actually embed some of these principles. If what you do is, let's say you look for examples first and then have AI, you challenge yourself to load sources of knowledge like in Notebook LM or other tools, and load all the great thinking from Bernie into your notebook and others, and then ask the AI to look for examples of how frame up the challenges and force yourself to look at what others are doing before you go to a solution, you're more likely to get a good outcome. And we often tend to use the AI to rush to the answer very rapidly and generate a report before the same thing in strategy. If you don't look for the examples and challenge yourself and get the good evidence, you're going to rush to a decision, which is very incremental.
I think that's exactly right. And so what I do is I run an exercise called challenging the strongly held assumptions of the industry. Innovation, in my judgment, and this gets off on a different topic, but it's relevant, which is when you talk about those that lead an industry, they typically take the most strongly held assumptions of the industry and flip them. So if you look at Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing, their big breakthrough was everybody thought that every single firm had to, back in the 90s and 80s, late 80s, 90s, everybody thought every single firm had to have a fab. You're a semiconductor firm, you have to have a fab. And everybody looked at the fab as the crown jewel. So, hey, we produce CPUs, but hey, take a look at our fab. We do DRAMs, but take a look at our fab, right? And what Taiwan semiconductor manufacturers say, listen, we don't need to do R&D. We can just do the fab. But we'll just play the fab game, right? In the meantime, the other players basically saying, hey, why don't we just play the R&D game? Forget the fab game. The fab game's too hard for us to play. But it's very hard to challenge strongly held assumptions because they're strongly held. And in fact, you have a strongly held assumption in industry when you say, you know what, why don't we do it this way? Flip it. And people get pissed off. They get really pissed off. So for example, take my world of academia. Okay, strongly held assumption, we need to have faculty at a university. Do we really? We need to have tenure at a university. Do we really? We need to have a physical campus where people can walk around and go capital. Do we really? Right. So the strongly held assumptions are ones where people just can't even believe it. They offend so many people. They're uncomfortable. This goes back to the ambiguity, the discomfort with saying, hey, why don't we create a university that doesn't have faculty, doesn't have classrooms, doesn't have tenure, doesn't rely upon research. I don't know. I didn't come up with it. So, but cars, right? Do we need drivers in a car? Maybe we don't. Waymo, right? So but these are like radical. When you're in that industry and you're constrained by the industry, you drank the Kool-Aid, and it's hard for you to step outside to see things. But you can, for any industry, you can say, here are the 7 or 8 strongly held assumptions about how to compete, and let's flip those. Let's play around with those and see whether those are ones we want to kind of think about challenging.
Well, look, if you want to reimagine whatever, fill in the blank, reimagine blank, you have to be willing to challenge some strongly held assumptions if you're truly going to reimagine it. And, whether that's a new product innovation, a new business model innovation, a new customer experience, it's the same principle of being willing to kind of ask those 5 whys, really get to the core, and then ask, like you said, Drucker, you introduced this at the front of the conversation, how would we do this differently now? If we had to start again, how would we do it differently now? And give yourself the permission to really reimagine it. If you don't create that space to do that and really be open of it, you're just going to get tinkering at the edges.
The other thing is that you extend this. I'm thinking about a particular client of mine, but basically what they did, without going into details, so they took N-2 levels down to the office of the CEO, set them off into a room for 6 months. They had still their day job, but basically said, tell us where we think the industry is going and what you need to compete in the future, right? So they spent months and months and months. Basically, the conclusion was, we're screwed. We're going to end up being a low-cost commodity player unless we do ABC. And but that was a group that had charged with the responsibility. They were high potentials, N-2. They were unconstrained by the economics of the current business. They were thinking differently. It's just one vehicle to think about how we might be able to create an exercise for us to get to the future.
I'm going to switch the gears slightly, connect a little more to culture and back in leadership again. What we're talking about here is reimagining and being willing to challenge the strategy. Often what I find is there's a framing around better, faster, and cheaper, Bernie. And you can think of it as like, I didn't invent this, like, it's language I love. If you think of a triangle, there's 3 sides, better, faster, and cheaper. And which of those is longer is a core to the strategy. Are you more better, faster, and cheaper? You can work on all 3, but there tends to be one of them that dominates the strategy in terms of your choice. And what people often don't recognize is the cultural alignment to this is important. If you've chosen historically to be very good at better, and then as you need to abandon and you need to evolve, you decide you need to become better at faster, as an example. Your culture may be aligned to better and not to faster, which would inhibit your ability to shift. So actually understanding where your culture is today is one of the things that I've been focusing on a lot in my leadership accelerator that I'm collaborating on with Simon and James, who've also been on the podcast. And people can go to lxaccelerator.net. I mentioned this in the book review for your book, because I think there's some connections, particularly around understanding how your culture is aligned to your strategy. I think Bernie's choices are 100% right. But if you don't understand how your culture is aligned to this, we'll use it again here. We used it in our last podcast. Culture will eat your strategy for breakfast, which Drucker didn't actually say, but he gets credited with saying it. But if you don't want culture to eat your strategy for breakfast and you understand these cascading choices, take a look at whether your culture is aligned. And then the leadership experience is critical to abandonment. It's critical to innovation. It's critical to being able to actually make sure you behave in a way that shifts the organization in a way that's aligned to the new direction.
Exactly right. I mean, a culture, the tricky part on the culture side is we need to figure out how specific individual behaviors can reinforce the customer centricity. So in a sense, the interesting question to ask each person inside the organization is, how does your job support a better customer experience for segment A, right? And let people play with that idea to kind of get role alignment. Every single job in the company should be aligned with that. So for example, you take a look at somebody in billing. Billing seems like a trivial issue, but it's not. If their billing is an issue and how we do billing, how we transmit the billing, how we understand the billing, how do we create a better experience, around what that might be, right? So that's back in the bookkeeping, accounting department, right? But they can make that alignment. Supply chain, how do we have the right materials for the right crop, the right product? The customers want product X. How do we do that? Talent management, how do we hire people that fit with delivery against that particular segment and what they're looking for and what type of experience they're looking for in that segment, right? So all of this comes back to culture. It comes back to actually roles and alignment and understanding how in each individual, since it's an organization-wide activity, how does each individual in their role support this journey to be more customer-centered? And that certainly touches on this issue of what the culture is and how to think about the culture.
Bernie, I can't say enough to the audience how much I enjoyed reading your book, and I really encourage people not to just settle for my review, but to read the real thing. They'll get a lot of value out of that. I know it'll spark a lot of great ideas for people and hopefully energy to act. If you had to lead people with one thing, to leaders out there to take away the right mindset shift from the soul of strategy, what are your parting words of wisdom to folks?
The parting words of wisdom are: don't accept customer insights as the basics of table stakes of how to play the game. Ask yourself a simple question. What do I know about customers that other people don't know that I can leverage to gain competitive advantage and to drive profitable growth? That would be the message.
Fantastic. If folks want to, learn more or reach out, is LinkedIn the best way to get in touch? Is there a website for the book they should go to other than ordering at Amazon?
The Soul Strategy is a website. They certainly reach me directly at my CGU, Claremont Graduate University edu. So Bernard Jaworski at cgu.edu, or through LinkedIn. Happy to interact in any way that makes sense.
Bernie, I always learn a lot when we chat. Thanks for sharing the gift of your time with the audience, and really enjoyed our conversation.